Good morning. We're kicking off the day with a trilemma, a new trilemma that's haunting the global economy. And according to Professor Dani, Rodrik, you can't pursue climate change, fight climate change, expand the middle class in the developed world, and ease global poverty all at the same time. You can achieve two, any two, but at the expense of the third one. So with the developed world planning to spend 2% of its GDP in the coming years, i.e. a tenfold increase currently, with its plan to help the middle class in their respective economies, do we run the risk of destroying traditional paths to development? How do we accelerate climate mitigation while helping the poor and ensuring that consumers and workers are not left behind? I'm really privileged this morning to introduce to you our speakers. Gore, former Vice President of the US, Chairman and co-founder of Generation Investment Management. Dani Rodrik, Ford Foundation Professor of International Political Economy, Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Teresa, Ribera, Executive Vice President for Clean, Just, and Competitive Transition of the European Commission. Gilberto Tomazoni, Global Chief Executive Officer of JBS. Professor, let's start with you. It is your premise, this trilemma. Talk to us about the different dimensions and what are the risks for the developed and developing world.
Well, thank you very much. First, good morning, everyone, and I'm really thrilled to be in such company. I raise the possibility of a trilemma mainly as a challenge and to get us to think about these three issues simultaneously. I do think that the trilemma can be overcome, so and I think that is the good news, and I hope we'll be talking about this. But my worry was that many of the policies that we're engaged in run the risk of essentially leaving at least one of those three out. I would say that probably under Trump we might be leaving all three out as well. So that's
don't say that.
Well, I'm hoping that maybe somebody will here or in the audience will convince me otherwise. Mm-hmm. But I mean, to set the stage, I do think that these three issues are fundamental issues confronting the world economy, and often, as we do in the various sessions here in the World Economic Forum, we think of them as separately. And so what I wanted to do was get us to think about the spillovers from our approaches in one area onto the others. I don't need to say anything about the importance of the climate challenge and the green transition. What we need to do is obviously the greatest threat to our physical existence. But I want to say that the challenge of restoring the middle class is probably the social and political equivalent of the physical threat that we face. I think it's the need to shore up the middle class in the advanced countries we need to do that because I think the anxieties of the middle class, the erosion of the middle class has been behind the poisoning of our politics and the rise of far-right politicians. I think there is a fair amount of academic research that actually shows how labor market anxieties have been behind the increasing support for far-right and demagogic politicians. So that is an important challenge. And development poverty reduction, of course, is always is a key issue. The good news on development, of course, is that we made a lot of progress on this in the years before the pandemic. Hundreds of millions of people were lifted out of extreme poverty, thanks mainly to growth in China and some other parts of Asia. But the difficulty is that in all of these areas we're facing challenges, and if we try to address the middle class problems through increasing protectionism and trying to reindustrialize in the United States and Europe, that's going to have effects on growth strategies in the developing world. If we're trying to achieve our climate transition mainly by making fossil fuels and emissions much more costly, that has implications for lower middle class. It's politically very difficult. and export-oriented industrialization in developing countries is running out of into limits because of the changes in the technology of manufacturing and so forth. So we need to think of different ways of achieving these things in a way that can make them all compatible with each other. I do think we have solutions, and I hope in the second or third round we can talk about some of those.
Executive Vice President Ribera, I mean, we know that Europe is leading the charge when it comes to climate mitigation. The idea is to get to neutral by 2050. As you work towards that, do you see this trilemma?
Thank you so much. I'm also thrilled to be in this panel, and I will try to answer your question by developing a little bit further on what Professor Rodrik has been saying, because in fact I think that there are some takeaways from what you have said which are very interesting. The first of them is that we should not choose one or two between the three options, the three keywords that are being reflected in the trilemma, but to ensure that we work on the three of them, because in fact none of them could be working if we forget about the two others. But even more, these three objectives, work on action, act on climate change, ensure development, and recover and ensure the middle class, are very important in terms of economic security, economic performance, but also democracy. So the capacity to provide confidence to the society on the institutions and the model to be built on cooperation and good quality of life for everybody. And I think that this is very true. In fact, we cannot think of populism, parties defending or claiming to defend the popular classes when they speak against climate action, because in fact, climate is going to affect in terms of quality of life, health, and prospects for anyone in any country. The weather is going to impact on them, the new vectors in terms of health, but also economic security in the very micro individual aspects of our life. We have seen it in the fires in Los Angeles, in the flooding areas in many parts of the world, including Spain. So in fact, it is quite a contradiction, and we should be denouncing that it is a contradiction. Instead of thinking on the welfare of the people, we think on how much money we can do in the Arctic routes to transport whatever, or what other drilling possibilities we may find out to make short-term profits. So I think it's something we need to insist on that. And on the contrary, when we act on climate, when we try to push forward in this deep transformation of the economic model and the prosperity understandings, we are creating opportunities, lowering many important vulnerabilities and costs, and ensuring that the households can afford the energy bills. It's true that this has to be tackled taking into consideration the different timeframes. So it's not only that it could be much fairer in the long run, it is that in the transition times there may be transactional costs that cannot be covered by the middle class or the most vulnerable class. But I would say that it is also true independently on the geography that we are speaking about. So it is important in terms of the most developed countries, and it is even more important in terms of the developing countries. So I guess that the challenge is how we can combine the different pieces, always paying attention to the social impact of what we are doing, and always paying attention to the importance of investing much political energy in these three dimensions to keep the balance. Otherwise, it's not going to work, not to speak about not the middle class, but the most vulnerable groups of people all over the world.
We'll further unpack all the points that you mentioned, but I'll just bring in Gilberto into the conversation first. You have a global footprint across Europe, I think Mexico, New Zealand, Australia. How are you looking at green investments?
I think this is a great question, and I want to answer you the perspective of the agriculture, because agriculture is the core of our strategy. When you look for this trilemma, say, look, 65% of the adults that today live in a poverty, that this is rely on agriculture for their livelihoods. If we support agriculture, we can live millions of people out of the poverty. And at the same time, you can boost the economic development. And consider that 35% of the global job are tied with the food system. Then, first is that. Then we look at the second challenge. We know the forecast is by 2050 will be 9.8 billion people. We need to feed this growing population with more sustainable way. Again, it's opportunity for development. It's opportunity for growing economy. Third, I put third point here, is the farmers. We have the farmers at the core of our strategy because the farmers are the power for the transformation of the food system. And you need to support them. Then you look for the agriculture. We had the opportunity to start to discuss beginning in the room that agriculture has the enormous potentials to capture carbon from the atmosphere. If you capture carbon from the atmosphere, we are faced against the climate challenge. And then the last one, okay, so look, when you look, we have 2.3 billion people live in a poverty, or not poverty, if with hungry, face quite challenge of hungry. If we don't fix this undermine the stability. We cannot have peace with people with hunger. Means that, for our point of view, agriculture is the key to invest to face the challenge of poverty and economic development.
Gilberto, you talk about supporting agriculture and the farmers. How does that look like?
When you talk about farmers, for example, our supplier, 60% of our suppliers comes from small farmers. We are focused to supply them with financial and technology, because for business transformation, they need support. To invest in regenerative agriculture, we need to invest money, and the payback is longer than the traditional way to produce. If you are not create innovative system that support them to take the risk for this new way to produce, they are not do that. And they need support, not just the money, but they need technical assistance, how to do this. And you need to do with this, because this is the huge force for the transformation.
And Vice President Gore, of course, international trade, a key enabler. It's managed to cut the cost of green technologies, make it more accessible to a lot more countries. But when it comes to the developed world, there seems to be the perception or expectation almost that a green transition would help revive the manufacturing sector. Do you see trade-offs? How are you looking at how this might play out?
Well, when you say it might revive the manufacturing sector, I don't think that's the primary relationship between job creation and the green transition. Just yesterday in the U.S., the Bureau of Labor Statistics released the annual figures on job creation. Do you know what the number one and number two jobs in the U.S. are now? Solar panel installer and wind turbine technician. Number one and number two jobs. The International Energy Agency, and I'm a big fan of Fatih Birol and his outstanding team there, have estimated the creation of 15 million new jobs over the next 5 years if we head on the net zero pathway that he and the IPCC have recommended. It's very, very jobs intensive. This is a great panel, and it's an honor to be with my colleagues here. I wanted to respond to Gilberto's comments and support the idea that regenerative agriculture, without the heavy plowing and without the chemical inputs being overdone, can sequester more carbon in the soil. And it was not until the mid-70s that agriculture and land clearing was no longer the number one source of anthropogenic CO2. I have a conference on my farm every year on regenerative agriculture called the Climate Underground. But if I may, I want to, and Teresa and I have admired your work for years, and Professor Rodrik, I do want to say a few things about your comments and your thesis. I respect you very much. I know your heart is in the right place, and I honor the years of scholarship you have put into defining this framework. I would very gently and respectfully challenge your premise. I think it was John Maynard Keynes who said, when the facts change, I change along with it. What do you do, sir? My general challenge to your premise is based on the fact that I think maybe the facts have changed from the period in which you formed your premise. One thing that has changed a bit unexpectedly is that solar energy has become by far the cheapest power in the history of the world. I was on a panel yesterday with one of the largest solar producers, and in some geographies they're getting down the price down to 1 cent per kilowatt. I mean, it's fantastic. And now that energy storage is following the same similar Wright's law cost reduction curve, that's why all these jobs are being created. And the fossil fuel sector is the wealthiest, most powerful business lobby in the history of the world. And unfortunately, they're way better at capturing politicians than capturing emissions and capturing policies. And we now subsidize fossil fuels and the ongoing destruction of humanity's future at an absurd rate. And let me say one final point, because I know you have to move it around. I had the privilege of knowing a Russian poet. He's now deceased, Yevgeny Yevtushenko. He wrote a famous poem about a man who came to the edge of a chasm and was trying to decide whether to leap across it or not. Could he make it? And the point of the poem was, don't try to do it in 2 leaps, because that doesn't work out well. I think that that's, in some ways, where we are with the energy transition and the sustainability transition. We have to make a commitment to go all the way. But this business lobby is fighting tooth and nail in every form, international, national, even local. I fight them all over because they will not allow a single policy change that reduces the consumption of their products by a single gram. And you know, in the world as a whole, we saw reductions in poverty for quite a number of years, and then it stopped in reverse. Why? Climate. So the climate damage in developing and developed countries has halted the creation of the alleviation of poverty. The climate crisis is both a huge threat to humanity's future, and we have to scale our moral imagination to comprehend how serious it is, but it is also the greatest opportunity for income enhancement and job creation in the history of the world. But we have to embrace this change, and that means we have to overcome their opposite. They're losing their financial basis, the financial basis of their power. They're losing electricity generation and beginning to lose transportation. Petrochemicals will take longer, but they're going to lose their ability to stop progress in its tracks. Finally, I think that embracing fully and completely this transition is the way to create more jobs and resolve the underlying conflicts that you identify as a trilemma.
let's pick up on jobs, right? Executive Vice President Ribera. When we talk about climate change in Europe, it is about jobs. It is about upskilling. How is that going, and what is the right approach?
I think that it is about jobs and it is about long-lasting business opportunities. But
It has
is
to be
very
about good
important-
jobs.
Yes, good jobs. What it was stated in the SDGs list, decent jobs, good jobs. And it is about long-lasting business opportunities. I mean, it's about not failing in trying to identify what the prospects of profits may be. So it's true that the fundamentals are changing in terms of how we can create wealth and how we identify losses. But I think that something which is very, very important is to count on people back in such a speedy transition, because it has to be very fast. The time is quite a crucial aspect. And in order to do so, it's not only that there are great opportunities for business, it's that people need to embrace this opportunity. They need to experience that this is something that impacts positively in the way they live, in the way they can afford their bills, in the way they can count on a much more healthier context, or in food security. So this is how I think we need to set this. And it's true that connected to the energy transition, we are not only speaking about molecules or electrons. We are speaking about industry. We are speaking about lowering the vulnerabilities and the dependencies coming from abroad. It's true that in Europe the assessment is quite clear. We cannot think of a competitive industry if we need to rely on something that we do not produce, as it is fossil fuels. So, of course, it is mainly climate and security in the middle long term, but knowing that we are already experiencing very horrible and hazardous weather events that are impacting terribly in our economy. It is that, in fact, it makes economic sense. And in fact, what it is irritating is that we need to be quite explicit on the benefits of what we are doing, including, and this was figures that were issued yesterday, that we have been able to save more than $59 billion in Europe since we started to lower our dependency from fossil fuels coming from Russia in this recent crisis. So it has an impact. Of course it has an impact. We take it for granted, and it is, even in this context, quite challenging in terms of the very short-term policy measures in economics. And I agree that it is very interesting to count on the cost of the CO2 to be reflected in final prices as a means to change the behaviors of the companies. But we also need to understand that this has an impact on the individuals, even in the industries that need this electricity and that see this reflect of the cost in the prices. So you cannot go out and say, now this is going to be very expensive, because it has to be manageable and affordable in the transition times. This is why we need to relate the different aspects, and we cannot say this is just showing what is the real cost, because that cannot be, how to say, absorbed, accepted, and it would not be fair. So I guess that combining these social aspects, this concentration of policies around the weakest part of the societies, but also around the middle class, is quite key. And thinking that we cannot solve this challenge in an isolated manner in a single country regarding the local community needs, but thinking in parallel in what are the related effects elsewhere, beyond our borders, beyond our regions, and how small is the world and interconnected is the world, is very, very important. This is why, this is also a very important statement these days, an international order based in rules and cooperation is so important. Nobody's going to make gains in a disastrous, confrontational world, and it has taken decades to build this multilateral system. We have here someone who was praising for an agreement back in 1992 around these issues. And tackling global challenges in this context, including food security, is quite key. There is nobody in the world that is going to solve this issue on his own. So I think that these two things are very important too.
So it's all interconnected. Professor, I just want to bring up your trilemma does not really take into account energy security. When you speak to, I think a lot of governments, I can only imagine that they would put energy security above fighting poverty, above expanding the middle class. How do you factor that in?
Well, I mean, there is a very important theme that has emerged from what the people already have said, and I just want to emphasize that because I think we're in full agreement on that, and that is that, that we need to embrace the green transition as an opportunity and not as a cost. And I think that's very important. That's one of the important facts which you, Mr. Vice President, mentioned, is how the cost of renewable energy has fallen and has changed many of our calculations. And I think that fact reflects that we have gone about the green transition in a way that actually sort of economists and our technocratic elites had suggested was not the way to go. Because we thought that the way to go was to make fossil fuels and carbon emissions more expensive through carbon pricing, cap and trade, and so forth. Instead, most of these gains, including the cost, the collapse in the cost of solar and wind and so forth, has come from trying to make renewables cheaper. So that has proved politically a much more viable strategy, because would you rather hit people with a stick and with a tax, or would you actually hand out benefits and make it easier for people to innovate and firms to run down the cost curve? And that's exactly what has happened. Frankly, a lot of the reduction in the cost of renewables is due to Chinese industrial policies. I think President Biden's IRA was the American version of those policies by trying to innovate and give consumers and firms an incentive to use renewables and reduce costs. And indeed, the fact that now there's so much jobs are being created in solar and so forth is a consequence of these industrial policies in the United States. And that's exactly the right way to go. And this is exactly how you make the green transition an opportunity for job creation, for investment, for innovation. And if the political dynamics work out, actually, if you create the support for the green transition, then it's easier to bring the fossil lobby, or at least weaken their support. The last time I looked, political contributions like the renewables was about a third of the contributions, political lobbying and campaign contribution to fossil fuel. Now, still, it hasn't come up all the way, but considering where it was coming from, how small it was, you can see the political balance is sort of changing, and I think it just reinforces what the Mr. Vice President, you have said. So I think the challenge comes, and I think this is an opportunity, is when we take this model to the developing world, where now, even excluding China, the majority of the emissions are going to come from. How do we make that model of actually, sort of incentivizing the green transition and generating growth and using as an investment strategy in the developing world? This is something that, as the Chinese example or the IRA example in the US shows, it's something that costs money, because a lot of it is in fiscal incentives, subsidies. Developing countries don't have the resources to emulate those kinds of policies. So if we want to bring the developing world along, we need to think about where the resources are going to come from. And here you mentioned, Teresa, the importance of global cooperation. And frankly, I think the EU and US need to be more cooperative here, because a lot of the public resources, a lot of the resources will have to come from the developed world. I don't want to put the EU on the spotlight, but when you have a policy like CBAM, I can understand it. It's exactly what you need to make carbon pricing within the European Union politically viable, and I support CBAM. But the revenues that CBAM generates could have been shared with developing countries, for example. That's one way to contribute to this transition. Or, the Biden administration, which has done so much in terms of the green transition in the United States, opposed one of the principal ways in which public resources could be raised for developing countries, which was the allocation of additional SDRs in the IMF, which everybody agrees is a relatively inexpensive way of creating public resources. But even there, we don't get enough assistance. So facts have changed. There is a way forward. But we need to think about how developing countries are going to fit into this green transition. It requires more public resources.
Could I respond to this? I don't disagree with what you've said, and I certainly support your point on the SDRs because the IMF and the multilateral development banks have to address the gross injustice in the system for the global allocation of private capital. I have delved into this pretty deeply and used to think that the public funds were the way to go. And of course, the developing countries in the COPs are demanding more, and I will endorse that, but it's politically quite challenging, to say the least. If you look at where the financing for the solar and wind and battery revolution and EV revolution has come from, 85% of the funding has come from private capital. But there is what's called a home bias, and most of it has been going to the US and Europe and China. Why? That means that 85% of the money in the US, Canada, has come from the private sector, only 15% from public funding. In Africa, take Nigeria, only 15% comes from private and the 85% from public, which they don't have. Why is that? It's because most developing countries are essentially walled off from access to private capital because of the extra risk factors of currency, valuation changes, the continuity of government, enforcement of contracts, corruption, et cetera. These extra risk factors are sometimes overstated, but they have served to prevent developing countries from having access. Now, the entire continent of Africa has fewer solar panels than the single state of Florida in the United States. That is a disgrace upon the international system for the allocation of private capital. And it has to be changed, and it has to be addressed. Now, the continuing subsidies for fossil fuel, leave aside your points about that. I support CBAM very strongly. I hope that Europe will join up with China somehow in linking what they're talking about there. And I have found, to my surprise, that some Republican members of the House and Senate are actually in favor of a version of CBAM in the US. And I've asked them, well, how can you do that without some kind of fee? And they said, well, maybe that'll be a backdoor to get to it. And in fact, there is a methane fee now in the Inflation Reduction Act, and it's working extremely well. But even without a CBAM or a carbon fee, a price on carbon, sort of like the two-state solution in the Middle East. Everybody knows we've got to go in that direction, or most people do, but it's just so difficult, people even stop talking about it. But even without that, we have to eliminate the public subsidies for fossil fuels. They have politicians, and many politicians in my country, under their thumb. They dare not, and they have also financed a lot of this so-called grassroots, it's called AstroTurf, financing this supposedly spontaneous uprising. The stories have all been written. They've financed that and encouraged it.
I don't disagree. On the contrary, I agree with the two of you, and I guess that 45 minutes is not enough. But,
Yeah.
but in fact, to me, this is the conversation in this gathering, and the conversation in general terms in the global society. I think that this is very important to understand. Yes, CBAM probably is the translation of the CO2 cost, or one of the translations of the CO2 cost in terms of borders and the level playing field in industrial terms. But I think that, yes, you are right, and yes, I think that this turns back to what how risky is to invest in development and what type of development we want to promote. And there is a very important role to be played by the SDRs and the IFM. Of course, it was the easiest part of this conversation. But the development funding, the development banks, the de-risking of these private investments, the logistics that can promote educated people, sound institutional responses, capacity to use their natural resources in a fair manner to create development, the way we understand the development of the urban areas, the type of services that they can provide in terms of water supply is as important as energy supply, or mobility in metropolitan areas. There may be a clean and a dirty solution, or many cleans and many dirty solutions. So how we can promote and how we can facilitate that development is a healthy development, and what is the involvement and the political engagement coming from the more developed world, knowing that most of the development partners that are going to figure out what is our climate risk in the time to come is being financed by banks working on development that are not Western banks. So this is also very important. And we come back to China, not only taking into consideration some of the examples that you have raised in terms of the industrial policy, but the type of development that China funds is going to be more important than any other single thing in the world. So it is in our interest that we can partner, combine, and ensure that there is not only a level playing field, but also a quality approach in terms of what type of development we are promoting. And of course, Africa or Latin America or Eastern Asia have great expectations, and they are very fair and legitimate expectations to count on a much more sound development partner in their societies. And I think that this is why we cannot think on how many additional barriers we are going to build, but how we can work on a cooperative manner with different societies and partners.
I would like to highlight, because the discussion goes to renewable energy, to change the renewable energy. And it's true, we need to do that. But I want to ring the flags that agriculture, today, just 4% of the investment from the climate change goes to food system. And the small farmer just take 1%. And we talk about 67% of the poverty live in agriculture. They relies on agriculture. We have a growing population. We have people hungry. And you not look that. We just look for, we need to transition from the fossil fuel. But in reality, if you want to tackle the climate change, we need to invest in agriculture. They have the potential to cap from 10 to 20% of the global emissions of CO2. Means that it's not fair in terms of, when you look this, or not see it's just a gap of financial investment. It's a gap of human situation, because we leave the people to live in the poverty, people suffer the hunger, and I think the world need to open the eyes on that, and then we start to be and some developer company, they have a good ideas, they have regenerative agriculture, and they try to enter in some market, they try to protect, use as a carbon footprint as a protection for import. I think this discussion about agriculture should go in the center of the discussion of the climate change, because farmers can make the change of the food system.
I totally agree. And governments around the world are easily convinced to give money to farmers in whatever the political system is. But it's often given for the wrong, in ways that create the wrong incentives. In my country, for example, the biggest subsidies for farmers is the so-called crop insurance program. In order to qualify, you are not permitted to use many of the regenerative agriculture approaches that you and I support so strongly. We should compensate farmers for the carbon that is sequestered. There are now new developments in measuring and testing the sequester of carbon through regenerative agriculture. And if we compensated farmers for that basis, it would help them get over the transition period of 2 to 3 years. And farmers want this because the climate-related extreme events are making their farms more vulnerable to water erosion and wind erosion. Just a couple of passes with intensive plowing releases all the carbon. You have to stop the intensive plowing. Another point, the role of banks, Teresa, excellent point. And if you look at what the 60 largest global banks have done since the Paris Agreement, they've given another $6.9 trillion to fossil fuel development, expanding fossil fuel. I mentioned the paucity of solar panels in Africa. Africa now has 3 times as many oil and gas pipelines under construction and proposed for construction than in all of North America. New refineries, new LNG terminals, new extraction sites, even new coal mines. Because that old system that the fossil fuel lobby supports has the free flow of capital to more and more and more fossil fuels, which are killing us. If we make this transition, we can create the jobs, put farmers at the heart of it. Anyway, you're right, 45 minutes is not enough.
And we have 4.5 minutes left. I would like to take a few questions if I can. Anyone? Yes, please.
I'm Suman from India. Just a question. You have been working at this for many, many years. Do you see hope? Or because the discussion is complex. It's not trivial.
Yes.
Everyone has been working at it, and everyone takes from a point of view of their economic interest, their energy security, their middle class. But the solutions necessarily require multilateral systems working. So is there really hope, or, this is one more?
Yes, there is hope. There's an abundance of hope. The late economist Rudy Dornbush, who I know you knew, Dani, he had a law named after him, Dornbush's law. It says this: things take longer to happen than you think they will, and then they happen faster than you thought they could. And we are now at an inflection point, partly because of what we've discussed, this incredible reduction in the cost of renewables. If you look at the #1 market for fossil fuels globally, it's electricity generation. You look at all of the new electricity generation installed worldwide last year, what percentage was renewable? 87%. We're getting there. The IEA says it's going to 90% and then 95%. Their second largest market is transportation. Electric vehicles are continuing to rise. The rise has slowed a little bit, but they're taking over because the cost continues to come down dramatically. So yes, there is ample hope. And there is a new generation that is a tailwind for this hope. I'm very optimistic. But we are going to solve this, I'm convinced. But the question is, will we solve it in time to avoid some of the unbelievably catastrophic risk that we have facing us? You look at Valencia and what happened there. 93% of all this heat is going into the oceans. The Mediterranean's been like a hot tub, and so the atmospheric rivers dropped a year's worth of rain in 8 hours on Valencia. The fires in LA, hydroclimate whiplash. We had 2 winters with massive downpours that supercharged the growth of vegetation. Then last March, the rain stopped. They've had no rain whatsoever for more than 300 days. And so all that fuel at record amounts, it's the driest it's been in 50 years, some say, by some measures since 1850. And then the Santa Ana winds come at 160 kilometers per hour, and they've always come. They may be getting stronger, may not, they don't know. But they used to come during the rainy season. Now, the disruption of the hydrological cycle means that the dry season is extending into overlap with the Santa Anas. They've got other fires there today. So we have to scale up our moral imagination to see not only the deadly existential threat that we're facing. It's the Gulf Stream could shut down, the list goes on, but also the incredible magnitude of the opportunity we have to get back on track to restoring dignity and sustainable incomes for farmers and for middle income and poor people around the world.
We'll take the next question.
Hello, my name is Roxana Kiritsoya. I'm from Romania. I'm part of the Global Shippers delegation as well as the trained climate reality leader.
Oh, thank you.
So first of all, let me take this moment to say thank you. You have empowered so many young people around the globe to speak up about the climate crisis and the solutions. What role do you feel the young generation plays in solving this particular trilemma?
Very simply, we have everything we need. The IEA says we have all the technologies we need and proven deployment models to cut emissions by 50% in this decade, and we have clear line of sight to how to do it for the remaining 50%. And on the theme of hope again, if we get to true net zero, the IPCC has come with a brand new, amazingly hopeful conclusion, a very robust finding. If we get to true net zero, the temperatures on Earth will stop going up almost immediately. a lag of only 3 to 5 years. If we stay at true net zero, then half of the anthropogenic CO2 will have fallen out of the atmosphere in as little as 25 to 30 years. Passive nature-based carbon removal can begin to lower temperatures again. Young people, the one thing people doubt we have in sufficiency is political will. But please remember that political will is itself a renewable resource, and young people can renew it.
Any other question? Anyone?
Can we get another 45 minutes?
No, I want to talk about hope. You talk about how, we're at that inflection point and there is hope, and in comes Trump, who likes to pull out of the Paris Agreement and, pose a setback to this progress. How are we looking at how it's going to look in the next 4 years?
Who
Still
wants
hopeful?
to take that question?
I mean,
You want-
there is,
No?
it's very, it's very hard to be optimistic given what the incoming President Trump has done. But, if you wanted to concoct a positive story, it would be that some of the under changing political conditions is that now the renewables and the green sectors, they have some political weight in the United States that maybe they did not have 4 years ago. So it might prove actually more difficult for President Trump to take away some of the IRA benefit. Many of them are actually tax incentives that are actually written into the law, so it's not directly, cannot be written off by executive order. But if you wanted to be optimistic, you'd say, and along with the vice president, that it's not just, that the political dynamics, everything from the young generation who were asking for this, to the self-interest of businesses. Yes, the fossil fuel lobby has been incredibly important, but now there is another lobby arising, and I think that's also politically what gives me a bit of hope.
Also, state governments and local governments will continue the push. And I went to a meeting of the electric vehicles industry in U.S. The keynote was by a conservative, Trump-supporting, MAGA, election-denying congressman from South Georgia, who waxed eloquently about the virtues of electric vehicles, maybe because the largest battery factory in North America is being built in his district. We are seeing in the red states a growing support for this energy transition, and I think we're going to continue. Europe is staying the course. China, each of the last 12 months, China has installed as much solar as energy as would be provided by 19 1-gigawatt nuclear plants per month. This revolution is accelerating, not slowing down.
I think that, look what it is happening this week here. My feeling is that in general terms, people participating in this gathering is pointing out the messages coming from Washington as the wrong direction, and insisting on the conviction that, well, they will have to manage the situation and navigate the complications, but the sense of direction is not going to change. So this is going to be more difficult, but there are 192 countries that belong to the United Nations and that want to keep on going on climate action. And I think that the economics are there. The importance of the middle class, and this is one of the aspects that I like about this trilemma, and then I think that the explanation that Professor Rodrik has made on how, in fact, we should be tackling the different aspects at the same time is so important, because we need to pay attention on how an average citizen considers, understands, and defends what it is important. And this is why it is so important that we connect to the young people, but in general terms, with the people. So that people step up and say, hey, guys, politics is something that is renewable. But we want to be sure that we are in the right side and that you are working in the right side. And this is why I think that it is even worse. It's a question of how peaceful we want to be in terms of cohabitation, coexistence in a society, and how much we trust the institutions and the democracy as a means, as a way to provide comfort and reassurance. So I think that working on the middle class protecting the most vulnerable people is very important, but stepping up and not taking for granted whatever we have considered that is within reach today is very important. We need to be loud and clear saying what we want, what we want to achieve, and what we are not ready to accept.
And on that very hopeful note, please join me in thanking our panelists today.